All right, thank you for joining us today, everyone. We're going to get started with our webinar, Groundwork, the Foundation and Evolution of Conservation Authorities in Ontario. We're going to close the polls now and let Mario take it away.
Good morning. I'm Janet Ivey, Chair of the Latornell Steering Committee. On behalf of the committee, Conservation Ontario, and the University of Guelph, I'd like to welcome you to the Latornell Leadership Project. As I'm speaking to you from Guelph, I will begin by acknowledging that Guelph is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and is home to many First Nations people, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe people. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. 2020 has been a year of change in many ways. Reflecting that, the Latornell Steering Committee is engaged in a review and reimagining of our annual symposium to make sure it continues to meet the needs of our community. While that work continues, the Latornell Leadership Project is bringing us together through a series of webinars. These sessions explore best practices on top-of-mind subjects, including a look at conservation through the land use planning lens, how to communicate during a pandemic, and how to ensure inclusion and diversity planning for green spaces. We aim to bring you first-person stories and tactical advice from Latornell's network of past, current, and upcoming conservation leaders. For the past 26 years, the Symposium has brought Ontario conservationists together to talk about the big issues and develop the collaborations we need to find solutions. We look forward to reconvening in 2021. So if you haven't already, keep in touch with us by signing up for our newsletter at latornell.ca, and thank you for joining us in the Latornell Leadership Project. Now I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's session, Deborah Martin-Downs. Deb has been the Chief Administrative Officer of Credit Valley Conservation Authority since 2013. Prior to leading CVC, she was a director with Toronto and Region Conservation Authority and spent 16 years as an environmental consultant with Gardner Lee. She has a Bachelor of Environmental Studies, a Master of Science in Zoology and Environmental Studies, and an Honorary Doctor of Science from Lakehead University. She's been a member of the Latornell Steering Committee since 2009, is a Director of the Conservation Ontario Board, and is the founder of the Conservation Authorities University. Thank you, Deb, for moderating today.
Well, thanks, Jan, for the opening remarks and introduction. We have an awesome turnout today, folks. We have 258 people on the line, so it's a terrific session for us today. So the webinar will highlight the genesis of the Conservation Authorities Act in 1946, the evolution of the conservation authorities over the next 70+ years, and the leadership of conservation authorities today and into the future in safeguarding the lands, waters, communities of Ontario. As Jan noted, I'm not only a Latornell Steering Committee member, but also chair of the Conservation Authorities University, which is an executive management program by conservation authorities for conservation authorities. Conservation authorities are unique organizations, and this is the only model like it in Canada. The first lesson we teach our participants at CAU is about the history that led to our formation, the conditions at the time, the players, the various legislative responsibilities. There's a lot of misconceptions about conservation authorities, so this session should set some of the records straight. None of us were at the table in the early 1940s, so it's important to remember our past as we pursue our future. The format of the webinar is 3 presentations, and it's followed by a short discussion of curated and questions from the floor, also known as the chat box, or the Q&A box rather. So, and you can feel free to contribute questions throughout the webinar. There are a few housekeeping notes for this morning. So first, all of you are muted and you will not be able to speak or come on video, but you are welcome to use the chat box to discuss amongst yourselves. You will find a Q&A icon in the bottom of your screen, and if you'd like to ask a question of any of our panelists, please type it into the box and just press enter to have it posted. If you'd like to include which panelist you'd like to address it to, that would be helpful. And you can upvote a question that you like by pressing the thumbs up button. So if it's already been stated, just vote for it and we'll see that it has more popularity. We will be reviewing the questions and we'll have time to pose a few of them to our panelists at the end of the webinar. So feel free to interact with others in the chat box as you've been doing. It's a terrific engagement over there. So, and to our panelists, a reminder to use your mute button when you're not speaking, and of course to unmute yourself when you are. As you noted when you joined, the webinar is being recorded so that members or others who are not able to attend will be able to listen at their leisure. And before I introduce our panelists, let's look at the results of our poll. We can bring up those results. All right, let's see. How many of you were wearing PJs today? Well, apparently most of you, 52% are saying you never do, and a bunch of you are actually wearing PJs some of the days. So we also, your affiliation, conservation authorities, 54%, and a good smattering of other interest parties along the way. What year was conservation authorities first passed? Well, I already gave it away, but 1946, so that there's certainly a variety of answers there as well. How many conservation authorities are there in Ontario? Well, 80% said there are 36, and you would be correct. And the final is who was the minister who introduced the Conservation Authorities Act? Well, we have quite a variety, but you didn't win if you won if you said Dana Porter. And for those alumni of University of Waterloo, you'll recognize that as the name of the library. Close that. All right. And so without further ado, we're going to introduce our first panelist, Rob Messervey, and we'll have while we're loading his presentation, we have a poll question for you to test your knowledge, and you'll have to listen very carefully to Rob because the answer will be in his presentation. So Rob Messervey spent 8 years as CAO of Kawartha Region Conservation after a career with Autonomy Conservation, Central Lake Ontario, and the Lower Trent Conservation Authority, as well as 22 years with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, starting in 1986 with regional and then provincial responsibilities for the Conservation Authorities program. Rob is currently co-owner of Native Plants in Claremont. He is also faculty of Conservation Authorities University, where he teaches the history of CAs. So you can see why Rob is a natural to start us off this morning. So welcome, Rob, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Deb. I hope everyone can hear me. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you about the early days of the Conservation Authorities movement. I've been involved with conservation authorities for a while, actually since the summer of 1973 at the Autonomy CA, and I'm still very much involved. I want to thank all of the participants for being with us today and for your interest. So we move to the next slide. The outline for my presentation this morning, in my 20 minutes, starts with the Badabin of conservation in Ontario. Badabin is an Ojibwe term. A friend of mine uses quite frequently. It's the golden glow in the eastern sky just before the sun emerges over the horizon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about conservation in that Badabin prior to the genesis of the Conservation Authorities movement, which I'll then move to. And then that leads to the Conservation Authorities Act and its passage in 1946, and a few things behind that, that occurrence. Then I want to talk about the earliest conservation authorities. Why did they form? What was the impetus behind the early formation of some of those conservation authorities? Then into some of the really important amendments to the Conservation Authorities Act following the 1946 passage of the Act, which really enhanced and strengthened the mandate of conservation authorities, as well as bringing along the province with a strong funding and policy support relationship. My last slide will be on that, the provincial and conservation authorities partnership around that time in the early 1970s. Next slide, please. So the Badabun of conservation in Ontario goes back a long way, even before 1890, which was really a significant milestone. The Royal Commission on Fish and Game was established. And that just demonstrates that there was a lot of focus, even in the late 1800s, about wildlife management and habitat, fisheries, and so on. There was a lot of US influences at the time as well across the border. The Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, Soil Conservation Society of America, all flourishing and really demonstrating some significant focus on conservation on the state side. Here in Ontario, really, really remarkable. Algonquin Provincial Park established in 1893, and then the Rondeau Provincial Park the year following in 1894, established as wildlife preserves in those days, but very prescient for the province to have set aside those lands that early in the days of conservation. 1928, the Ontario Federation of Anglers was formed. A real habitat focus, again demonstrating, and even in those days, there was a significant concern and a demonstrated willingness to try and protect habitat, both from a wildlife point of view and an angling point of view. 1931, the Federation of Ontario Naturalists was formed from an amalgam of quite a number of naturalist clubs across, particularly southwestern Ontario, but across southern Ontario, there's a bit of a precursor to what's preceding the Conservation Authorities program. Next slide, please. So to talk about the genesis specifically of conservation authorities, I'll point to 1932. The Grand River Conservation Commission and the act to support it passed in 1932. The backdrop slide is the Dunnville flood on the lower Grand River in 1932, which obviously provided impetus to the formation of the commission, which focused on water supply, but primarily on flood control in the lower Grand River. The commission was comprised of 8 municipalities in the lower Grand. In 1933, the following year, just again, a very significant impetus to conservation in Ontario. The Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District in Ohio was established. And you can see on my slide, it was established to carry out a comprehensive flood control and water conservation program on a watershed basis. So the federal government invested into Ohio, into this watershed, about $22 million in 1933, a pretty significant sum of federal dollars in 1933. An initial plan for about 14 dams and reservoirs for flood control, but also significantly for water conservation and recreation and fish and wildlife. Next slide, please. Also in the United States, again, a really significant demonstration of growing conservation interests. The Tennessee Valley Authority, established through a federal act signed by President Roosevelt. And the TVA was created as a federal authority. And Tennessee River Basin is the 5th largest basin in the United States. Most of Tennessee and 6 other states were involved. So a very, very cross-state interjurisdictional model, and very, very significant for its time. And it was established to tackle a number of problems: flooding, forestry management, water quality, and very, very importantly across the basin, hydroelectric generation. So it was established to address really integrated resource management and some of the development issues affecting the health of that valley region. And the valley had experienced devastating floods, significant erosion on very significant areas of agricultural land. There's also some really significant economic challenges, including outmigration from the basin. So this is the first major watershed and basin scale of conservation management in the United States. And it's really a precursor, I think, to the principle of integrated watershed management. The conservation authorities, through the Association of Conservation Authorities in Ontario, which used to have biennial tours, actually visited the TVA in 1985. Next slide, please. Continuing on, 1935, I mentioned it in an earlier slide, the U.S. Soil Conservation Act and Soil Conservation Society with broad activity right across the entire United States, setting a good model. In 1936 in Ontario, right in behind, the Ontario Conservation and Reforestation Association was formed. This is a London-based group. It was formed to deal with issues of drought and deforestation, agricultural needs such as water supply and water quality. Really a county municipal formation, and was focused to deal with how do we establish reforestation programs? How do we deal with water supply for farms? How do we deal with sound planning to not impact significant areas in pollution control? And as we'll see through a number of other slides and some of the literature, as we were moving through World War II, and the okra was one example. A plan was established in the early World War II days for establishing new life, as they call it, after the Civil War, World War II. So Watson Porter from London was chair of okra for a number of years. He became the chair of the Upper Thames Region Conservation Authority. And this okra was formed 1 year before the devastating floods that affected London. The slide on the right is just a photo of condition of the Ganaraska headwaters on the Oakridge Moraine, and just one example of some of the really resource management issues that were really coming to attention in those days. Next slide, please. Now, importantly, in 1941, during World War II, the Federation of Ontario Naturalists and that okra group held the Guelph Conference with 4 major objectives. I won't read through all 4 objectives, but really of significance is a broad group of municipal, provincial, environmental agency representatives coming together to look at how can we best coordinate our efforts towards program of conservation in areas that are really critically in need. To also facilitate government, municipalities for support and guidance and word of direct effort. To give impetus to implementing conservation measures, and to educate and bring others along. Also importantly, out of this conference was identified the need for a pilot survey. So ensuing the report that came out of this conference, which is entitled Conservation and Post-War Rehabilitation, references that document, that report, had been prepared in the belief that a program of conservation can do a vital service to the province, and at the same time contribute in an important degree to the national problem, here we go again, of reestablishing men in civil life after the war. So there's quite a focus on that post-war scenario. Next slide, please. So the report that was suggested of a pilot survey focused on the Ganaraska, called the Ganaraska Report. So the decision was made to conduct a geographic specific survey and study, and the Ganaraska watershed was chosen partly because of the significant erosion on the Oakridge Moraine, as well as historical flooding in the Port Hope area and the lower Ganaraska River, and is also a manageable study area. You can see in 1943, when the report was produced, one of the key recommendations coming out of that report is that legislation be enacted combining the best features of the Grand River Conservation Commission, which you recall was established in 1932, and the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District of Ohio. Again, here's a big influence from the United States in kind of influencing our thinking here in Ontario, so that municipalities in any part of Ontario may undertake a similar conservation program. Very significant recommendation out of that report. Next slide, please. 1944, establishment of the conservation branch within a new department of planning and development. Many of you no doubt are aware of the role of A.H. Richardson, who became director and wrote a very significant book on the conservation of Ontario, Conservation by the People, after he retired. He hosted the London Conference in 1944. So that was in part to deal with how everyone would respond to those recommendations of the Ganaraska survey, how to set a new direction for conservation for Southern Ontario on a coordinated basis. River Valley development was the theme. Considered that Tennessee Valley Authority model. That's why I kind of introduced that earlier. Looking at integrated valley management, also what could we learn from the Skingham watershed model in more detail. So it was the very first reference to conservation authorities, that language, 1944. And a really strong commitment to the notion of conservation being driven locally and regionally. Also importantly, out of that conference was a resolution to urge the government of Ontario to create what's considered a conservation authority for Ontario, very broadly, with, you can see here, principles of cooperation promoting conservation projects. Next slide, please. So almost to the establishment of the Act, 1945, another important report, the Thames Report, having dealt with the 1937 flood in London, but also very significant issues in the Upper Thames watershed, in particular with farm water supply shortages, water quality issues, how to deal with waste management in the watershed. There had been historical flooding events before 1937. So in 1945, with all of that backdrop, with the lessons learned from those initiatives in the United States, formation of conservation groups in Ontario, leadership from the provincial government. In 1945, the Conservation Authorities Act, Bill 81, was ready to be introduced. The legislation wasn't passed in 45 because the legislature was prorogued in the fall. But, next slide, please. It did make it through the legislature, in 1946. The premier at the time was George Drew, who was premier from 43 to 1948. And he was premier of a conservative government. It was the first of 6 consecutive conservative premiers until 1985. That's an interesting consideration, in terms of at that time. There was really strong support for the Act across all parties. It was an extremely forward-looking piece of legislation for its time. And many of the key principles of the 1946 Act are still in place, I think, as we all know. Next slide, please. So some of the guiding principles out of the Act in 1946, and I have a copy of it here with me, and some very interesting language, but I tried to capture a few of the most significant or relevant elements of it. Obviously, the principle of authority formation by municipal support, and to be a corporate body, so conservation authorities are independent in terms of their ability to function and operate, and to initiate their own schemes was the term in the Act, as we use programs and projects obviously now, but schemes around flood control. And you can see a whole number of matters of resource management there, wildlife, forestry, and so on within the framework. Gave the authority powers to expropriate land, with consideration of preserving, protecting, setting aside significant lands for management. To be able to elect its own board and hire staff, seek cooperation with departments of the government, and how to raise funds, particularly through senior government grants and municipal levy. The Act was set under the Minister of Public Works, interestingly. It suggests an emphasis at that time on capital works projects initially. But really significant provincial oversight came with this Act as well. To the extent that the minister had the option of appointing chairs of conservation authorities, for example, but I don't think that was exercised very often. But strong provincial oversight and support through the Act. Next slide, please. So why did a number of the conservation authorities form when they did? So this shows the conservation authorities landscape early on, 1950. You see there was a pretty good establishment across southern Ontario at that time. So why did the early conservation authorities form and when? Next slide, please. So the very first conservation authority is Sauville River. It was formed, as their report describes, based on a move of desperation in establishing the watershed. A lawsuit by a farmer, a Dr. Hegmeyer, he sued the townships of Besanquet, McGilvery, and Stephen for damages due to municipal drainage works in the headwaters of Park Hill Creek, which created flooding and a lot of damages across his lands. And that, in large part, provided impetus with the support of the Conservation Authorities Act for the formation of the Sauville River CA. And I think minutes later, based on the legislative process, the Etobicoke River was number 2, formed the same day. And the Etobicoke River had produced a very comprehensive conservation report for the watershed that noted a number of issues. You can see there a lot of water supply issues, there's been a lot of deforestation, historical flooding. And number 3, Ganaraska. A few months later, obviously building from the Ganaraska report, the recommendations for the watershed out of that pilot survey. And I've alluded to significant erosion issues on the Oak Ridges Moraine, those very fine wind susceptible soils from deforestation, a lot of flooding in the area. But also as to, in the Ganaraska report itself, there was a plan to identify work for returning soldiers. Carrying on, next slide, please. So here we are. You've served the country well, young man. Now go out and conserve. Was a bit of the theme in the late 40s. It's interesting as you read through the literature, though, there was a very significant economic upturn in Ontario, and that notion of having to use conservation projects as a means to put people to work really didn't come to fruition. The economy really did move along well. But it all that reference though did strongly support the notion that we needed to put major effort into conservation at this time. Next slide, please. So just continuing on, the 4th conservation authority to be formed, South Nation, 1947. Significant record of flooding on South Nation and some of its tributaries. And you see that flood damages, and also on the converse, drought, a major impetus for the South Nation River Conservation Authority forming. The slide on there, or the photo on the right, is historical flood in 1947 on the South Nation River. The Moira, number 5, just a couple of months later formed. Similarly, flooding and historical ice jamming in Belleville, significant damage over the decades in Belleville. Some water quality issues in some of the lakes and tributaries in the upper Moira, the main impetus for its formation. Next slide. So the next authority to be formed is the Upper Thames, and this is a picture of the organization meeting held in October of 1947. I just want you to note the youthful and gender balance of the representatives. We've come a long way, but this is the group that did it, that really brought the Upper Thames together. Next slide. So just a bit more on the Upper Thames. I mentioned the 1937 flood, just huge impacts, not only on London, but some of the other municipalities, particularly up and downstream. The Thames report had noted both significant issues which provided that impetus to authority formation. So there was a vote in early 1947 involved the entire Thames River watershed, the upper and lower Thames. All municipalities from all ends of that watershed were brought together. The initial vote lost. And the reason for that was a lot of the lower Thames representatives were not in support. The vote lost by 28 to 26, needed a 2/3 majority for Conservation Authority's formation at the time. So the upper Thames decided to go it alone. And the second vote in September carried by a vote of 24 to 7. We still see today that we have an upper Thames authority and a lower Thames authority. Notwithstanding,
Rob, we're going to need to move a little bit quicker. Can you finish up quickly? Thank you.
Yeah, almost done. Thank you. And the seventh authority, Napanee Valley. Here we are in 1947. Again, drought, low water, and the need for water conservation on a watershed basis. Next slide, please. That's a picture of the first dam construction in Napanee in the early 1950s. Next slide. So the other authorities established pre-Hurricane Hazel in 1954. There we go, quite a number. And total, actually, of authorities formed before Hurricane Hazel, which is a bit of a misconception, was 19. And very significant when you think that Hurricane Hazel did provide a huge subsequent impetus to Conservation Authority formation. Of note here, the second last bullet, the Neebing Valley, the very first Conservation Authority formed in Northern Ontario, 1954. I think that's pretty impressive. So moving on, please. Next slide. So just 2 more slides. Conservation Authorities Act amendments that followed the 1946 Act, which I think really garnered a lot of strength and support for Conservation Authority mandate. You see 1952 administration costs were added to the Act so that they were considered a viable, fundable aspect of Conservation Authority operations. In 1954, recreation was added to the Act as an eligible program for CAs. In 1956, first reference to Conservation Authority regulations were established. In 1960, interestingly, 14 years after the Act was first established, first reference to the appointment of 3 provincial appointees, each Conservation Authority. That was significant in terms of the partnership. Next slide. Just carrying on in 1968, I'll just reference the very last point under 1968, which is a really important element of land management, where the Act provided for reassessment of CA lands, so to lower tax application to what was becoming a very significant part of the CA program, land management. 1970, further amendments to broaden the regulatory oversight of conservation authorities. And also the first reference to regional municipalities, which were being formed in the early 70s in terms of how they supported conservation authorities. Next slide. So my last slide is just my perspective on the Provincial Conservation Authority Partnership. This is really up to about the 1990s. So I can say that from the period from 1946 to the 80s, a very strong provincial oversight and participation and support for conservation authorities. Very significant funding from the province in virtually all CA programs. And in those days too, there were supplementary grants which provided smaller authorities with lower population and watershed assessment up to 85% funding for water control programs. There was provincial support along the way for the expansion of the CA mandate, supported by legislation and policy and funding. Provincial appointees on all the boards demonstrated provincial interest. And even the general managers, who were called resource managers, even into the mid-late 80s, were actually M&R staff funded by the province. I was one of those. and they served as staff of the Conservation Authority, but reporting to M&R regional directors. So I'll just summarize at this period, there was a very strong provincial and regional network of M&RCA program staff in support of conservation authorities, as well as very strong political support to the program. Very collaborative, a lot of joint advocacy. And then I'll just say, then we come to 1995, and I will finish there because Chris Jones is going to speak to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. That was a great foundation for our audience, and it always amazes me that the environment was top of mind in the mid-1940s with all the other issues happening in the world at the time. But they too saw the opportunity for the environment to provide employment and at the same time address issues, sort of a win-win. So I'll ask you to turn your camera off, and our next presenter is Chris Jones. And while we're loading up his presentation, we have a poll question for you to test your knowledge. Just like the first presenter though, the answer will be found in the presentation. Chris Jones is a professional planner with over 15 years of experience in the municipal and conservation sectors, including time as a campaigner with Ontario Nature, a policy planner with the region of Peel, and 10 years with the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority as a development planner. A fun fact that Chris was a candidate in the 2014 provincial election, and for those of you who know Chris, you know he's a bit of a political geek, so it would have suited him well. He's currently Director of Planning and Regulation for the Central Lake Ontario Conservation Authority. So welcome, Chris, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here. Sorry, I'm almost there. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So this morning, I'm going to walk you through some very weedsy policy material that I hope you'll find interesting. We're going to uncover the roots of how conservation authorities became involved in land use planning and development regulation in Ontario and trace some of the changes over time. The excavation is going to take place in 4 sections. First, the institutional frame, which includes the original legislative footings that enabled the structure for both land use planning by municipalities and conservation authorities to take place. Second, we're going to explore the nitty-gritty details of how the Section 28 regulations came to be and how they evolved. Third, you'll see examples of how our development review planning process began and was subsequently reshaped. Finally, I will cover the dramatic period, as Rob already alluded to in our history, the major changes in the 1990s that established the current framework. In this presentation, you'll see that I've cut and pasted text from scanned copies of the statute books and other things. If you're interested in the topics covered, I encourage you to come back to the presentation at a later date and read the fine print that you're going to see on the slides. Don't try and read all the text. The presentation will be available for download later. So first, part 1, the institutional frame for municipal and conservation authority planning. When you think of a public institution, you might think of a federal body, such as the Supreme Court of Canada, or a provincial institution, such as a provincial ministry. Conservation authorities are local public institutions. This presentation covers the roles that conservation authorities have played in regulating certain development activities directly through a regulation, as well as indirectly as a public body providing a technical role in developing, reviewing, and implementing land use plans and development proposals. In all of these activities, conservation authorities operate as public institutions acting in a statutory context. That means that the actions they take are enabled through legislation passed by the Ontario legislature. As Rob covered in his presentation, the Conservation Authorities Act was first passed in 1946. In this context, we should also note that the The Planning Act was also passed in the same legislative session. These foundational laws have always interacted with each other and established complementary institutions and programs within them that have profoundly shaped our province and are still fundamental to this day. The enactment of both the Planning Act and the Conservation Authorities Act, importantly under the umbrella of a single provincial Ministry of Planning and Development, meant that Ontario had a coordinated and integrated framework for planning, conservation, and growth. This slide shows the department's community planning branch on the left side, which was responsible for the Planning Act and its administration, and the department's Conservation Authorities branch, which is on the lower left, which was responsible for coordinating and building up capacity at conservation authorities. To the right, you can see an excerpt from the Planning Act at the top right and the Conservation Authorities Act at the bottom right. Both laws articulated in a general and enabling sense what these bodies' planning work was intended to be done and what they were required to do. And a main focus was collaboration with one another in development of plans. This is how planning based on environmental principles and of the integration of watershed planning into land use was started in Ontario, based in law, and it continues to this day. Now, while Ontario put itself on a wise path in 1946, it did not make us immune from natural hazards, as was experienced in the fall of 1954 with the devastating effects of Hurricane Hazel. This brings us to Section 2, the origins and evolution of the Section 28 development regulations of the Conservation Authorities Act. Hurricane Hazel was the deadliest, costliest, and most intense hurricane of the 1954 Atlantic hurricane season. When it hit Ontario, rivers and streams in and around Toronto overflowed their banks, which caused severe flooding and destroyed development in the floodplain. Over $1.3 billion in 2018 dollars of damage was incurred, and 81 people lost their lives. An especially hard-hit area was the Raymore Drive area in Etobicoke, where a whole street of homes, some with people in them, was washed away. It was recognized that stronger controls on development in floodplains would be necessary to avoid repeating another tragedy like that at Raymore Drive. The Conservation Authorities Act was amended in 1956 to add power for conservation authorities to make regulations related to the use of water and the location of ponds. This was a rudimentary start to the regulation. The regulation making power was then refined and innovated upon over a 17-year period between 1956 and 1973. Here's a quick walkthrough. In 1959, the power to regulate the placement or dumping of fill was added. In 1962, power to regulate the construction of any building or structure was incorporated. 1963 saw specific tests for decision-making related to control of flooding, pollution, or conservation of land in relation to fill placement. Further, power for the courts to order removal of unauthorized filling or structures upon conviction was added. In 1968, power was added to regulate alterations to watercourses. 1971 saw the ability to regulate buildings or structures in ponds or swamps, and the concept of the regional storm floodplain was added. 1973 saw the last major change during the 1956 to 1973 period enacted. Due process in the permit approval process was added by requiring applicants to have an opportunity for a hearing before the Conservation Authority Board in the case of a staff recommendation for refusal of an application. The table on this slide on the left side shows that by 1972, 22 different Conservation Authority regulations were in place. I'll note that no substantive changes were made to the Conservation Authorities Act between 1973 and 1996. The last major change that brought us to where we are today in terms of our Section 28 regulations was in 1998. These amendments made in 1998 added language complementary to the Planning Act and the provincial policy statement requirements for natural hazards into the regulation, greater protection for wetlands in their function of controlling flooding, Great Lakes shorelines, and the ability to approve with conditions, and provided a comprehensive definition of development that is to be regulated. The amendment strengthened the integration between the Conservation Authorities Act and Planning Act with respect to natural hazards. Now we're going to turn, now that we've gone through the regulation quickly, we're going to turn back to the land use and land use planning function to explore the origins and evolution of development review planning. Excuse me. At its origin, the Planning Act held much of the approval authority for the approval of official plans and plans of subdivision and other planning approvals with the minister directly. We're going to use the plan of subdivision process as an example. This slide shows the key elements of the plan of subdivision approval process, much of which are still in the Planning Act today, and the integration with the Conservation Authority review. These include the following elements. Approval was required from the minister. Draft plans had to show certain environmental information on them, such as drainage, swamps, and wooded areas. The minister required consultation with public bodies, including conservation authorities, to determine requirements and to finalize the plan. And in considering a plan, the minister specifically had to consider the health and safety, including the conservation of natural resources and flood control in the review. And of course, conservation authorities were vital to determining these interests of the ministry in the planning process, and they still are as it relates to our municipal partners. Now, if we flash forward 25 years to the early 1970s, you'll find an elaborate review process with many institutional actors. At this time, you can see the minister's signature was still required on every draft plan of subdivision for it to be approved. Now, conservation authorities provided the site-by-site review, and they also provided input both to the province directly through the Conservation Authorities branch and at the municipal level as part of their commenting process. This dual commenting role from the Conservation Authority to both the province and the municipality is shown in simplified form on this slide. The Conservation Authority would comment on its policy and program interests, including natural hazards, valley and stream protection, and environmentally significant areas. This slide shows examples of circulation documents from the time period illustrating this process. At this time, conservation authorities were highly integrated within the Provincial Conservation Authorities branch, as Rob mentioned, and were basically the eyes and ears in the field for the province in assisting with the provincial site-by-site development review approval process, especially related to natural hazards and natural resources. This era represents the height of what I would call the many cooks in the kitchen period. It was heavy on institutions, but slow, cumbersome, confusing, centralized, and light. Importantly, it was light on strategic policy setting. In the 1970s, and culminating with the reenacted Planning Act in 1983, the first reforms to the system were made. The Planning Act was amended to introduce matters of provincial interest, which included protection of the natural environment, coordination between public bodies, health and safety of the population. A new Section 2 established provisions for the issuance of policy statements approved by Cabinet. Under this section, the first natural hazard policy statement was issued in 1988's floodplain planning policy statement. Provisions for delegation of ministers' powers to municipalities were also added. Despite these initial reforms, by the late 1980s development boom, especially in Southern Ontario, there was continued concern that the planning system was not protecting the environment in favor of unbalanced development. This brings us to our final and fourth section, planning reform, fiscal austerity, and the strategic shifts that occurred in the 1990s. In the early 1990s, the Ontario government appointed the Commission on Planning and Development Reform, known as the Sewell Commission. After a 2-year period, the Commission recommended further delegation of review and approval powers. the province began increasing its delegation plan review functions to municipalities and conservation authorities at this time. Following the Sewell Commission's recommendations, the province introduced a provincial policy-led planning system with locally focused review and approvals. Provincial policies for the first time included comprehensive natural hazard, natural heritage, and hydrologic features and systems protections through the comprehensive set of policy statements, which came into effect in March of 1995. CAs were delegated sole commenting responsibility for plan input and review matters related to natural hazards, including dynamic beaches along the Great Lakes shorelines. The new policies that took effect in March 1995, though, were very short-lived owing to a change of government in June of that year that brought deep fiscal austerity to the agenda. Cutbacks at ministries led to an even faster than planned withdrawal from the development planning function at the provincial level. Transfer payments to conservation authorities for provincial program operating funding was announced as at a 75% cut, and subsequently implemented, as you'll see on this slide. This led to a long freeze in transfer payments, as you'll see, actually annual cuts when inflation is considered, leading to the recent 50% cut in 2019. 50 years after 1946, two laws amending the Conservation Authorities Act and Planning Act were passed at the same time. The Savings and Restructuring Act, as well as the Land Use Planning and Protection Act, which amended the Planning Act. There was a real fear this time that conservation authorities would be dissolved. Commenting on planning applications by ministries other than municipal affairs and housing was prevented through amendments to the Planning Act. So a dramatic shift from the state of the landscape in the early 1970s, for example. In 1996, the province settled on a slimmed down provincial policy statement that maintained previous policy directions for natural hazards and retained some natural heritage policies. The new system was referred to as the provincial one-window planning system. Conservation Authority and Conservation Ontario leadership at the time worked with key provincial staff to ensure that the local planning role for conservation authorities was retained. This success was codified through a memorandum of understanding between the province and Conservation Ontario, reconfirming the provincial delegation of natural hazard review to conservation authorities. Many conservation authorities, such as those in Durham Region, entered into partnership agreements with their municipalities that also included natural heritage review. The dramatic changes in the 1990s saw the province establish province-wide provincial policy and delegate the implementation of this policy to conservation authorities for natural hazards. The provincial withdrawal from site-by-site review for planning applications left decision-making in the hands of local decision-makers with whom conservation authorities had existing strong relationships. Moving to fee-for-service models helped conservation authorities fill some of the fiscal void. The municipal partnership was renewed with highly integrated and locally informed planning, working in partnership with conservation authorities that maximize the use of the provincial policy framework. So just to review, if you see on this slide, this basically shows that integrated framework that was there in 1946, but is still there today. The Planning Act, the Conservation Authorities Act, institutions, policies, and regulations continue to provide an integrated system of planning for conservation and growth in Ontario. But we won't leave you stuck in the 90s, however, as there's more to the story coming up. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Chris, for digging deep into the archives for those interesting linkages between planning and conservation. Although the original partners in that relationship has changed, clearly it remains an important part of our development review process. So our next presenter is Bonnie Fox, and while we're loading up her presentation, we have one final poll question for you to test your knowledge. I hope you've been listening for the answers throughout, because they're not actually giving them away, are they? So Bonnie Fox is the Manager of Policy and Planning for Conservation Ontario, which is the Association for Ontario's 36 conservation authorities. She's been with Conservation Ontario for 21 years, leading and coordinating policy positions to influence and respond to provincial and federal legislative and policy initiatives, including leading the input to reviews of the Conservation Authorities Act. Previously, Bonnie worked for the policy divisions of the Ministries of Natural Resources and Environment, specializing in water, land management, and land use planning. She's been living and breathing changes to the Act for the last 5 years and is the perfect presenter to bring us up to date. Last but not least, welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you, Deb. And everyone can see my screen? Okay. So I'm going to speak to the recent amendments. Sorry, I'm just going to... I'm going to speak to the recent amendments to the Conservation Authorities Act, highlighting the funding.
Bonnie, you're not in presentation mode yet. You may want to put it in the full presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's what my problem is.
Yeah.
Oh, that's much better. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to speak to the recent amendments to the Conservation Authorities Act, highlighting the funding implications and the importance of foundational watershed management activities to address some key challenges that we face and the importance of working together as the way forward. I'll finish it off with a recap of recent events surrounding the legislative amendments and provide you with just a few key takeaways. So a comprehensive review of the Act was undertaken from 2015 to 2017. The provincial process included consultation on a couple of discussion papers as well as engagement sessions before introducing Bill 139 in the spring of 2017 and releasing a 4-year plan called Conserving Our Future. Bill 139 received royal assent at the end of 2017. There was a much more streamlined process followed in the spring of 2019. We saw 2 Environmental Registry of Ontario postings in April, one regarding the amendments to the Conservation Authorities Act and one regarding our Section 28 regulations. From the ERO posting on the Act in April to royal assent of legislative changes in June, it was a tight time frame of 2 months. Bill 139 was entitled the Building Better Communities and Conserving Watersheds Act, and the province's positioning for changes to the Act was framed as strengthening oversight and accountability, increasing clarity and consistency in programs, increasing consistency in regulatory requirements, enhancing collaboration and engagement, and modernizing funding mechanisms. Bill 139 received royal assent in December of 2017, and the amendments of the Act that came into effect at that time included a new purpose statement, which you'll note that the correct answer was D to the poll, and clarifications of provincial, municipal, and watershed programs and services, which I'll speak about further. In addition to some other amendments noted on the slide, there were new clauses to enable the minister to conduct program and operational reviews. All of these amendments are currently in effect. Other amendments were not enacted because they required regulations and or policy development, and these included amendments that dealt with such things as regulating activities under Section 28 and modernized enforcement clauses. The 2017 amendments to the Act clarified that the purpose of a conservation authority is to provide programs and services that further the conservation, restoration, development, and management of natural resources in the watershed. Conservation authorities work with others to identify local priorities and then develop programs to support them. The 2017 amendments clarified conservation authorities' provincial, municipal, and watershed roles by outlining 3 types of programs and services that conservation authorities deliver. The first type are mandatory, and they are identified by the province. The second type are municipal, and these are services provided to a municipality through an MOU or agreement between 2 willing partners, and it's a local municipal decision. The third type are programs that a conservation authority board determines are a priority for the local watershed's shared natural resources, and that's a local decision. It's important for the Conservation Authorities Act to continue to support conservation authorities in the delivery of all three types. One type is provincially mandated, and the other two are locally mandated, and all three are part of a conservation authority's core mandate. I'll be speaking more to how these three areas are were further amended in 2019. So in June of 2018, there was a provincial election and a change in government. A new ministry was formed called Environment, Conservation and Parks, moving the Conservation Authorities Act from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry to MECP, involved the passage of orders in council that outline minister and ministry responsibilities for legislation and programs. The end result of these orders in council is basically MNRF has responsibility for natural hazard related clauses and MECP has everything else. These orders in councils were approved in October 2018, and then ministry reorganizations and transfer of staff occurred in April 2019 to align with the provincial budget year. So Bill 108 was entitled More Homes, More Choices Act, and Schedule 2 included amendments to the Conservation Authorities Act. It was introduced on May 2nd, 2019. The province's positioning as per the Housing Supply Action Plan for proposed changes to the Conservation Authorities Act was framed as defining Conservation Authority core programs and services, requiring municipalities to pay only for core services, and giving municipalities more say over non-core services and how they pay for them. Streamlining and standardizing Conservation Authorities' role in municipal planning to reduce overlap, making approvals faster and less expensive, and finally, improving governance and accountability. All of the new sections which received royal assent in June are not yet enacted. Presumably they will be once enabling regulations or policies are in place. If you look on e-laws at the current Conservation Authorities Act, you'll see that the sections that are yet to be enacted are highlighted in gray. So I'm going to jump to the fact that they added the ability to the minister to appoint an investigator and at the Conservation Authority's expense. As well, they added the ability for a conservation authority to levy costs to municipalities that are not CA members, but are provided services further to the Clean Water Act and or the Lake Simcoe Protection Act. This slide covers the amendments to the Programs and Services clauses from 2017. And these are also to be enacted once enabling regulations are in place. The amendment to the provincial or mandatory programs clause was to specifically identify them as natural hazards, source water protection, conservation lands, and Lake Simcoe, and to further indicate that standards and requirements would be prescribed by regulation. The only change to the municipal programs category was to include a clause that the supporting MOU or agreement with the municipality would be available to the public. The other programs clause, which are those that are determined by the board as advisable, and I would add therefore a priority for the watershed to be delivered, was also amended. Amendments include a requirement for an agreement with all municipalities if municipal levy is proposed to be used to fund the program. To support reaching the agreements, there's a clause requiring that each conservation authority develop a transition plan to ensure they're in compliance within the prescribed time frame. We've recommended 24 months for the transition period to enable the ability for the Conservation Authority to reach agreements with each municipality and to enable alignment with the municipal budget process and timelines. Given that a number of these amendments are focused on finances, I wanted to cover the status of existing provincial transfer payments. Conservation authorities get them for natural hazards and source water protection, programs that protect public health and safety of Ontarians. I wanted to highlight the 50% cut to the natural hazards program in 2019 and the fact that conservation authorities had to grapple to varying degrees with how they were going to address the cuts. The options included, for example, the use of reserves, not a sustainable solution, cutting staff or programs, and redirecting self-generated revenue, or increasing municipal levy. So if provincial transfer payments continue to be cut, will impact a conservation authority's ability to deliver programs and services. As noted in the slide, there is no provincial transfer payment for conservation areas. We're not expecting a provincial transfer payment for this program to be presented to us, and nor for municipal levy to necessarily cover this program. Our conclusion is that overall, the mandatory programs are funded by a combination of municipal levy, provincial transfer payments, and other sources of revenue, including self-generated revenue such as fees. I also wanted to highlight that fundamental watershed management activities enable conservation authorities to deliver effective mandatory programs. So these watershed management activities include watershed monitoring and modeling, watershed studies and plans, and watershed actions such as stewardship projects and outreach and education. Where these activities directly support each of the mandatory programs, then they should be considered eligible activities and eligible for municipal levy. For example, for the Natural Hazards Management Program, we need the monitoring information and the modeling and studies and plans to provide up-to-date flood forecasting and warning services, floodplain mapping, and drought low water conditions, for example. So these fundamental watershed management activities are critical for us understanding the shared challenge of a changing climate. The mandatory programs and services are all about reducing risks to public health and safety and the environment, identifying priority management actions through watershed studies and plans to reduce flood risks and to protect water quality and to retain water on the landscape during times of drought are all part of what we need to work on together. Environmental problems are quickly becoming more complex, yet there are fewer resources to address them. Many business sectors are starting to connect the dots between the environment and our economy. For example, natural disasters like flooding and public health issues like toxic blue-green algae in our sources of drinking water increase costs if we don't work to prevent them in advance. The watershed approach is a key solution because we all know that what happens upstream impacts downstream, and that's typically beyond individual municipal boundaries. We can identify problems and find solutions in a cost-effective way by leveraging funding, expertise, and knowledge. We also need the supporting frameworks which the province can provide through updated technical guidelines, policies that incorporate the watershed approach, and of course, funding. Having the watershed knowledge in hand, conservation authorities are a key player, as Chris talked about, to varying degrees in guiding development in our local watersheds. So some of the challenges with guiding development that we share are the need to protect public health and safety, to increase watershed resiliency, and to support sustainable economic growth, including agriculture. We recognize that these need to be achieved with a strong commitment to transparency, accountability, and timeliness. So conservation authorities continue to work on improvements to their planning, review, and permit approvals roles through our client service and streamlining initiative. We're working on solutions with the development and municipal sectors in response to the government's Housing Supply Action Plan that I referenced earlier. We also recognize that provincial policy leadership is required, especially for the Natural Hazards Program. We need the province to provide clear regulations with definitions and standards and technical guidance to support the conservation authorities. We're happy to work with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry on these, and note that Ontario's flooding strategy has identified these as priorities, and that flooding strategy was released in March of 2020. The pandemic has put a new lens on the value of our watershed services. Everything is local, including the important use of green space. Conservation authorities can help address the impacts of the pandemic by providing partnered shovel-ready projects that will support economic recovery. By continuing to streamline our reviews and approvals for development, and by ensuring we have improvements in place in our conservation area green spaces for social distancing. All of this needs to be done with a view to protecting the environment, public health and safety, and with support from provincial and federal funding programs in partnership with municipalities. So I wanted to wrap this up by highlighting some recent events since Royal Assent of Bill 108 in June of 2019. From October to early December 2019, the Minister's Office met with all 36 conservation authorities. As well, there was broader stakeholder consultation that occurred early in 2020 with a series of questions that focused on all conservation authority legislative and regulatory responsibilities. The same series of questions were posted as a public survey that closed on March 13th. And around that time, emergency declarations for COVID-19 occurred. Conservation authorities received helpful ministers' directions that have enabled conservation authorities to continue, the conservation authority boards to continue their business with electronic meetings. So that was really helpful. Currently, we're awaiting the results from the consultations, and the minister did speak to Conservation Ontario Council recently on September 28th. And when asked about next steps, he reiterated his intent to see legislative amendments this fall and also indicated regulatory amendments are forthcoming. So in conclusion, I wanted to leave you with some key takeaways. Number one, ensure that your municipalities and MPPs know the value of your conservation authorities, local partnerships and programs. As you heard from the other speakers, it's a really important part of the conservation authorities. Number two, fundamental watershed management activities enable conservation authorities to deliver mandatory programs, and they need to be recognized in any kind of regulatory framework that gets developed. And number three, moving forward, we need to continue working together on solutions to help us to address challenges more quickly and cost effectively. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Bonnie, for a great overview of where we are with modernizing the Conservation Authorities Act and our operations. Although I must say, when you think about what was being proposed in the 1946, we were pretty modern even then. So it'll be great to get this chapter of our history wrapped up though soon. So at this time, I'm going to ask all our participants to turn on their cameras and unmute themselves to have a bit of a discussion and give our audience an opportunity to ask some questions as well. So a reminder, if you want to ask a question, please enter it into the Q&A box, and that's accessible at the bottom of the panel bar. And if you like a question that someone's already posed, just hit the thumbs up and we'll rank those that are most popular. So we have a few minutes for those. So I'm going to start off though with a question that's directed to Rob, because as we heard in the presentation today, a lot has changed for the CAs in 1995 when the Harris government came to power. You were in the ministry at the time, and I'd love a little sneak peek insider's view of what was happening. I think it's safe for you to, fish a little at this time.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Great question, and it was interesting times for sure. I'll just say even in the 5 years preceding 1995 with the Bob Rae government from 1990 to 1995, there had been some fiscal pressures on the program. There had been a reduction in transfer payments. There had been some confining of the CA mandate, loss of supplementary grants, but still a really, really good provincial CA relationship. So enter the Conservative government of Mike Harris in 1995. By December of that year, the Minister Hodgson had tabled that Savings and Restructuring Act that Chris talked about, with pretty massive cuts to CA transfer payments. What had been in the $40 to $50 million range a few years previous went down to about $10 million by 1997. And parallel cuts also, M&R and MOE and other environmental ministries. This act that I mentioned focused provincial interests in just two areas of CA program: flood control and protection of provincially significant lands. So I was present with the parliamentary assistant to the minister, Frank Cleese, at a December meeting with the Conservation Authority chairs and general managers when that message was delivered. And it was a very tough day indeed, for me to be standing there with Mr. Cleese and witnessing the looks of, disbelief and, well, almost indignation on the faces of my colleagues and friends in the CA program across the province. But that was the fiscal reality at the time. So the result really of that, two things. The Provincial Conservation Authority partnership was, I'll say, pretty rough, and it was ruptured at that time because of that. the impacts to the program within MNR, the Conservation Authorities branch, and the suite of 6 regional MNR program areas supporting conservation authorities on a daily basis basically eliminated. The second major impact of the conservation authorities are suddenly faced with these massive reductions in transfer payments and suffered staff layoffs, shortened work weeks, discontinuation of a number of programs such as stewardship and education and conservation areas and management. So really a period of almost survival. But out of that, there has been a major silver lining. I think that might be another topic for discussion. But that's where
you're not allowed to ask that one yet. So overall, it sounds like it was kind of it would have been a tough position to be in, being that you had been in both CAs and in the province at the time. So I think that should be our next question is that, you know, as it seemed that we were doomed, but today we're still here, and I would hesitate to say we're stronger than ever. So I think there were some silver linings to this change, and we'd like to hear about some positive outcomes. So I'm going to start with Chris, if you would like to give us one, and then Bonnie, and then Rob.
Well, I think one is that it focused us locally. It really focused us on our municipal partners and the communities where our watersheds are located. So, you know, and I think that's where our focus should be. And so I think that that restructuring and change that happened in the mid-90s enabled us to make sure that our programs were focused on what our local municipalities wanted. And as a land use planner, with, you know, my career has been, for the most part, in the land use planning at a conservation authority, I've seen how indispensable we are in helping our municipalities undertake land use planning, and I think it's appreciated.
Great. Bonnie, would you like to offer one?
Yeah, I think the silver lining was the diversification of funding sources. You know, up to that point, 75%, you know, that money, that big chunk of money that was taken from the province, I think it really focused the CAs in. I knew Lake Simcoe went down to 12 staff due to those cuts. That's my local conservation authority, and, you know, look at them today. I think that, and it relates to what Chris has said, the whole focusing in on that local partnership as well.
And Rob, you have what's your silver lining?
I think the unity of conservation authorities that resulted. Conservation authorities had to come together to look at opportunities collectively to move forward with restructuring. There's sharing of best management practices, even some staff sharing. And I think now with the Conservation Ontario model, I think it's really brought conservation authorities together since, and it's a strong family as a result.
Great, thank you. Those are terrific. You know, I think those were exceptionally good things that came out of this. So we do have a few questions in the chat box, and I have one that I would like to pose. So let's go with how were different stakeholders included in water governance during the early days? And I know we're all sitting around the table, but is there some understanding of how farmers, industry, and maybe other utilities or industries were brought to the table to participate in the discussions? Do you have a sense on that, Rob, maybe?
Well, you know, I saw as part of the diversification that Bonnie was speaking to, I saw a lot of involvement of environmental organizations and agencies who we had been partnering with, but I think brought on a much stronger area of focus and support in organizations like the FON, Ducks Unlimited, you know, other provincial and even national organizations, Canadian Wildlife Federation. So I see a lot of those very strong, organized environmental agencies, you know, coming to work with and support conservation authority work.
So there's a interesting one here for you, Bonnie. I was hoping Bonnie could speak to the role of collaborating with local Indigenous communities with water and other natural resource management and how Conservation Ontario has sought and maintained such partnerships. If any other presenters have further comments on the involvement of Indigenous groups as well, that would be great. Bonnie, would you like to tackle that one?
Sure. We've had a few Indigenous engagement and Indigenous awareness workshops for the conservation authorities. We focus that on our senior managers and like the general managers and the directors across the conservation authorities, just to raise that awareness and to give them the tools to then do the local outreach with the communities that they're dealing with locally. We've incorporated that curriculum into our Conservation Authorities University program as well. And then we also have some significant partnership going on where we're trying to do Indigenous projects with, dealing with flood mapping. I'm respecting that, that's on their lead, and we're very much in a support role in that respect. And yeah.
Great, thank you. Actually, this one I think would probably fall to you as well, but given that many members of the public were not allowed to register for the public meetings that were held in the early winter, and that several actions were passed in omnibus bills with no public consultation. What are CO and CAs doing to engage stakeholders who wish to support CAs? So we'll start with you, and then maybe Chris would pick up on that.
Yeah. So in terms of Conservation Ontario, what we've tried to do is to get our own submission submitted as early as possible, like in advance of deadlines. With these short timelines, it's been really crazy just for us to pull together what our positioning is as a collective of 36 conservation authorities. So what we've tried to do is to get our positioning posted on our website as soon as possible. There's been huge social media campaigns that Nikisha and Jane have been pushing out. And as well, we've been meeting with the leadership of the various stakeholder groups, Ontario Federation of Agriculture, Association of Municipalities of Ontario, to make sure that they're all aware of what's happening and hopefully garner their support as well.
Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, at the local level, I can say that our Chief Administrative Officer has taken time specifically to meet with the watershed members of provincial parliament on that issue and on other issues related to our local conservation authority, just so that the lines of communication are open and they're hearing about, the conservation authority's perspective to our provincial MPPs. Also, there are board reports that staff present to the board, and of course the board of the Conservation Authority is made up of local, municipal elected representatives, and so that's been another avenue to communicate with other local leaders as well.
So that's about all the time for questions we have today. We may do our best to try and answer some in the chat box so people can access them later. But at this point, I think we'll wrap up. It's almost, it's 11:28, so I've got a couple minutes before the end of the webinar. So I would just like to say that this Latornell Leadership Project session has been brought to you by the Latornell Steering Committee. I would like to thank all those who helped make this happen, including Janet Ivey, who's been the chair of the committee, to Jamie Jowdry, the conference program chair, Nikisha Mohammed and Jane Lewington of Conservation Ontario, who are involved in communications, Andrew Catt of Conservation Authorities University, Mario Maillet and Karen Anderson of ALSET, who are the Latornell conference organizers, as well as help from Barb McKenzie-Winia, Katrina Furlanato, and Bill Ternuth. And of course, a big thank you to our presenters, Rob Messervey, Chris Jones, and Bonnie Fox for great presentations today. If we could all clap, we would, but we just have to give a thumbs up instead. So the committee would have been in the final throes of putting together the Latornell conference this month, and alas, we had to cancel, but we actually initially canceled because of the uncertainties, as Bonnie was outlining in her presentation, to the conservation authorities with the changes to the Act and potential funding implications. But COVID would have also meant that we would have canceled the biggest environmental conference in Ontario in any event. And as we reimagine the future of our conference, we hope you enjoyed this opportunity to keep in touch. I know it's not quite the same as meeting up in the halls at Latornell and catching up with your colleagues and meeting new people, but it will have to do. We have a few more sessions coming later this fall into the new year, so please keep a watch for our next webinar in November. There's the list of the ones that are coming up. So Planning 101 for non-planners, we just haven't set an actual date yet. So we will keep you all apprised. Since you signed up for this one, maybe you'd be interested in the next. And one more thing for you to do before you leave is please complete our last polls on the screen to tell us how informative you felt this webinar was before you leave. And a reminder that the webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Latornell Symposium website for anyone to watch. Just give us a couple of days to get it posted because it'll take a little bit to do that. So thank you again for taking time today to learn more about conservation authorities and more, and that conservation, I think you heard today that conservation matters as much today as it did in 1946. So stay safe, everyone, and bye for now.
Great, Deb. Thanks. Well done.
Bye, everybody.